Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. The secret lives of medieval widows. Forget everything you think you know about mourning, grief, and moving on. The truth, being a widow in medieval times was a death sentence served with a side of legal torture and social exile. You think losing your spouse is devastating today? Try losing them in an era where your entire existence was legally tied to their heartbeat. When the moment they stopped breathing, you became property up for grabs, where your grief was measured not in tears, but in how quickly you could be redistributed to another man. Tonight, we're diving into the brutal reality of medieval widowhood, and trust me, you probably wouldn't survive a single week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if these whispered histories truly earn it. Every click keeps our lantern glowing, and your support genuinely fuels me to bring more drowsy tales. Now, tell me what corner of the globe you're dozing in, and what hour the clock just sighed. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. We're going to be together for quite a while tonight. This is a deep dive, so get comfortable. We're going to explore not just what happened when medieval women lost their husbands, but the intricate web of legal, social, and economic traps that turned grief into a fight for survival. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to medieval Europe, where your husband's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was the starting gun for every vulture in a 50-mile radius to come for everything you thought was yours. Where widowhood wasn't a temporary state of mourning, but a permanent condition of vulnerability that society had perfected into an art form. Picture this, you're a medieval woman, maybe 35, if you're lucky enough to have lived that long. Your husband just died, could be plague, could be war, could be a toothache that went septic. Doesn't matter. What matters is that the man who legally owned your existence just stopped existing. You think you have time to grieve? Think again. Here's the thing about medieval law. Women couldn't own property, couldn't inherit land, couldn't make legal decisions. Your entire identity was wife of husband's name. So the moment he dies, you don't just lose a partner, you lose your legal right to exist as an independent person. And here's the kicker, his family is already at your door, not to comfort you, not to help with funeral arrangements, to inventory everything they think belongs to them now, because in their minds you were just borrowing their son's life, and now it's time to return the security deposit. Your husband's brother walks through your house, pointing at furniture, that's ours. Your mother-in-law starts going through your clothes, those need to go back to the family. Your deceased husband's cousin starts eyeing your children. They'll need proper male guidance now. Fun fact, under medieval law, widows were entitled to exactly 1/3 of their husband's estate. Sounds reasonable, right? Plot twist, that's only if his family decides to honor it. And they usually didn't. You know what your legal recourse was if they refused. You could petition the lord of the manor. The same lord who probably owed your husband's family political favors, the same lord who saw you as a problem to be solved, not a person with rights. Medieval logic at its finest. But wait, it gets worse. You're not just dealing with his family, you're dealing with his debts. Because guess what? Those transferred to you too. Your husband owed money to the baker. Congratulations, that's your problem now. He had a business dispute with the merchant guild. Welcome to your new legal nightmare. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part is what happened next. Medieval society gave widows exactly 40 days. 40 days to figure out the rest of their lives. They called it the grace period. Grace, like they were doing you a favor by not immediately throwing you out into the street. During these 40 days, you're supposed to accomplish the impossible: inventory your husband's estate, pay his debts, negotiate with his family, and somehow secure your own future, all while grieving, all while dealing with people who see your tears as weakness and your confusion as opportunity. Here's what's really happening during those 40 days. Every unmarried man in the region is being told about the available widow, not because they care about your emotional well-being, because you come with potential property, and property is opportunity. Think medieval Tinder, but instead of swiping right, they're calculating your net worth. Your neighbors aren't bringing casseroles, they're bringing marriage proposals, sometimes multiple proposals, from men you've never met, men who've heard you have a house, some land, maybe a few animals, men who see your dead husband's shoes and think, those would fit me perfectly. And here's the truly sick part. These men are encouraged to propose during the funeral, not after the funeral. While you're standing over your husband's grave, medieval romance at its peak. But let's say you're not interested in remarrying immediately. Maybe you need time to process the fact that your life just imploded. Maybe you want to focus on your children. Maybe you actually loved your husband and the thought of replacing him makes you sick. Too bad. Because medieval society had very specific ideas about women without men, and none of those ideas involved you living independently. A woman without a husband was a problem. A widow without a suitor was in a crisis. A widow who actively refused remarriage was a threat to the natural order. The church had opinions about this. The law had opinions about this. Your dead husband's family definitely had opinions about this. And all those opinions started with the assumption that you couldn't possibly know what was best for yourself. Speaking of the church, they had a special role in all this. They were supposed to be your advocate, your protector, the ones ensuring you weren't taken advantage of during your vulnerable time. Yeah, that didn't happen. The medieval church positioned itself as the guardian of widows. They quoted Bible verses about protecting widows and orphans. They spoke beautifully about Christian charity and community support. They made widowhood sound like a sacred calling, a spiritual opportunity to draw closer to God through suffering, and then they charged you for everything. Want your husband buried in consecrated ground? That'll cost you. Want prayers said for his soul? Pay up. Want the priest to help mediate disputes with your husband's family? Hope you have something valuable to trade. The church owned vast amounts of land, controlled enormous wealth, and preached about helping the vulnerable. But when you showed up as an actual vulnerable person, suddenly everything had a price tag. Here's what they didn't tell you about church protection. It came with strings attached. The church would help you, absolutely. In exchange for your land, your possessions, or your commitment to join a convent. That's right. Their solution to your widowhood was to make you disappear entirely. Join a convent, give us all your worldly possessions, and spend the rest of your life in prayer. Problem solved. You're no longer a vulnerable widow society needs to worry about. You're safely locked away where you can't cause any more inconvenience. And if you refused, well, the church had other ways of encouraging your cooperation. They could declare your marriage invalid retroactively. Suddenly your children are bastards with no inheritance rights. They could claim your husband died in sin and refuse proper burial. They could spread word that you were consorting with demons or practicing witchcraft. Medieval culture was lethal, but let's say you navigate the church politics successfully. You manage to keep your property, avoid the convent, and maintain some independence. Congratulations. Now you get to deal with the legal system. Plot twist. The legal system was designed by men run by men, and operated on the assumption that women were essentially children who needed male supervision. Every legal document required a male witness. Every property transaction needed male approval. Every contract had to be co-signed by a man. But you're a widow. You don't have a man. So how do you conduct any legal business? You find a male relative willing to help, and hope he doesn't decide your property would look better in his name. You hire a male legal representative, and hope he doesn't collude with the opposing party. You remarry quickly to get legal protection, and hope your new husband doesn't immediately sell everything you brought to the marriage. Medieval women's rights in action. Let's talk about money, because everything we've discussed so far assumes you had some. Most medieval widows didn't. Your husband was a peasant farmer. His death means you lose access to the land you both worked. That land belonged to the Lord, and it was leased to your husband, not to you. When he died, the lease died with him. Your husband was a craftsman. His workshop, his tools, his guild membership all belonged to him personally. Some guilds allowed widows to continue their husband's trade temporarily being the key word. Usually just long enough for you to find another husband to take over. Your husband was a merchant. His business relationships, his credit, his trade connections were all based on personal trust and male networking. Good luck maintaining those as a woman who couldn't travel alone, couldn't enter male-only business spaces, and couldn't make binding agreements without male oversight. And here's the kicker, even if you managed to continue earning money, you couldn't keep it all. Medieval law required widows to pay special taxes, widows' taxes, because being bereaved wasn't punishment enough. You had to pay inheritance taxes on property you already lived in. You had to pay protection fees to local lords who promised to keep you safe. You had to pay church tithes that were higher for unmarried women because you needed extra prayers for your vulnerable state. Must be nice. But wait, there's more. If you had children, you were responsible for their support but couldn't control their inheritance. Your sons inherited their father's property when they came of age, but until then you had to maintain it without having legal ownership. You could improve the property, increase its value, work yourself to death keeping it profitable, and the moment your son turned 21, he could kick you out. Your daughters needed dowries to marry, but you couldn't arrange marriages without male oversight. So you had to pay other men to negotiate your daughters' futures while having no guarantee they would secure good matches. And if you couldn't afford dowries, your daughters faced the same fate you did. Vulnerable women in a world designed to exploit them. The economics of medieval widowhood weren't just unfair, they were systematically designed to force women back into marriages whether they wanted them or not. Speaking of which, let's talk about your romantic options, because they were uniformly horrible. Remember those marriage proposals that started during your husband's funeral? Let's meet your suitors. First up, your husband's brother. He's not interested in you personally. He's interested in keeping family property in the family. Marrying you means he gets control of whatever you inherited. Plus he can claim he's doing the Christian thing by taking care of his brother's widow. Medieval logic, if one brother owned you, surely another brother can too. This arrangement is called levirate marriage, and it was considered both legally sound and morally praiseworthy. Never mind that you might have hated your brother-in-law when your husband was alive. Never mind that he might have been the one causing problems in your marriage. Never mind that the thought of him touching you makes your skin crawl. Your feelings are irrelevant. This is about property management. Next, the elderly widower with grown children who hates you on sight. He needs someone to manage his household and care for him in his declining years. You need legal protection and financial security. It's a business arrangement disguised as marriage. His children will spend every day trying to turn him against you because they see you as competition for their inheritance. You'll spend every day walking on eggshells, trying not to give them ammunition while caring for a man who resents needing care. Peak medieval romance. Then there's the young man who's been told marrying a widow is an easy path to property ownership. He has no money, no prospects, and possibly some interesting habits involving alcohol and other people's livestock. But he's charming, he's available, and he's willing to marry immediately. What could go wrong? He'll spend your money, sell your possessions, and disappear the moment things get difficult, leaving you widowed again, but this time with debts instead of assets. Don't forget the foreign merchant who barely speaks your language but has heard about available English widows. He promises to take you to exciting new lands where you'll live like a queen. He neglects to mention that exciting new lands means a trading post 3 months travel away where you'll be completely isolated. unable to communicate with neighbors and totally dependent on him for survival. And then there's your personal favorite, the local lord who's decided you'd make a suitable mistress. Not wife, mistress. He already has a wife, but you'd make a nice side arrangement. He's powerful enough that refusing him could mean losing your property entirely, but accepting means becoming a social outcast while still having no legal protections. These are your options. These are the men lining up to rescue you from the terrible fate of independence. So what happened if you looked at this parade of romantic disasters and decided you'd rather stay single? Medieval society had a response to that. You can't. Seriously. In many regions, prolonged widowhood was illegal. Laws existed requiring widows to remarry within a specific time frame or face penalties. These laws had lovely names like widows' fines and spinster taxes, because nothing says we respect your grief like putting a timer on it. But some women tried anyway. They developed elaborate strategies for avoiding remarriage while still maintaining some kind of life. Strategy 1. Claim illness. If you were too sick to marry, people might leave you alone temporarily. Of course, you had to maintain this fiction indefinitely, which meant never appearing too healthy in public. Some widows spent years pretending to be chronically ill just to avoid unwanted suitors. Must have been exhausting. Strategy 2. Claim religious calling. If you announced you were dedicating your life to God, people might respect that. Might. It also meant you had to live like a nun without actually joining a convent. No socializing, no fun, constant prayer, and wearing whatever the medieval equivalent of a hair shirt was. Strategy 3. Become too poor to be worth marrying. Some widows deliberately impoverished themselves, selling off assets and giving away property until they had nothing left that would attract a husband. They chose poverty over forced remarriage. Think about that. They chose destitution rather than endure another marriage to a man they didn't want. Strategy 4. Become too difficult. Develop a reputation as a shrew, a troublemaker, someone no reasonable man would want to marry. This meant sacrificing your social relationships and community standing, but it might keep the marriage proposals at bay. And here's the really sad part. These strategies sometimes worked. Medieval records show women who successfully avoided remarriage for years or even decades. But the cost was enormous. They lived as social outcasts, economic pariahs, constantly looking over their shoulders for the next person who would try to force them back into marriage. Because medieval society never gave up. There was always another suitor, another legal challenge, another family member trying to prove you were incompetent to manage your own life. Speaking of incompetence, let's talk about the legal concept that made all of this possible: coverture. Under medieval law, women existed in a state called coverture. It meant you were legally covered by your husband's identity. You couldn't own property, sign contracts, or appear in court independently. Your legal existence was essentially paused while you were married. When your husband died, you didn't suddenly gain full legal rights. You entered a weird liminal state where you had slightly more rights than a married woman, but far fewer rights than a man. You could appear in court, but only with male representation. You could own property, but only temporarily, until you remarried. Here's where it gets truly insane. If you remarried, your new husband gained control of everything you'd inherited from your first husband. Everything. Your first husband's family property, your personal belongings, even items that had been in your family for generations. Marriage wasn't just a personal relationship, it was a legal transfer of ownership, and you were part of the property being transferred. Let's say your first husband left you a house, some land, and a decent sum of money. You're financially secure for the first time in your life. You have options, freedom, the ability to make choices about your future. Then you remarry. Doesn't matter why. Maybe you fell in love, maybe you were forced, maybe you just got tired of fighting the system. The moment you say I do, everything you own becomes your new husband's property. He can sell the house your first husband built. He can mortgage the land your first husband farmed. He can spend the money your first husband saved. And you have no legal recourse. Because under coverture, you don't exist as a separate legal entity anymore. Plot twist: if your second husband dies, you don't inherit everything back. You inherit 1/3 of whatever he owned at the time of his death. If he sold your first husband's property, too bad. If he spent your inheritance, tough luck. You're left with a fraction of what you brought to the marriage. This system was designed to ensure that property stayed in male hands regardless of how many times it passed through female ownership. Women were temporary custodians at best. And here's the really sick part. Medieval legal scholars wrote extensively about how this system protected women, protected them from the burden of property management, protected them from the complexity of legal decisions, protected them from the dangerous freedom of independence. They genuinely believed they were doing women a favor by making it impossible for them to control their own lives. We need to talk about what happened to your children when you became a widow, because it wasn't what you think. Your sons belonged to your husband's family line. When he died, they technically became wards of his male relatives. You could raise them, but you couldn't make major decisions about their futures without male oversight. Their education, their apprenticeships, their eventual inheritance, all had to be approved by your husband's brothers, uncles, or the local lord. Your daughters were dowry obligations. You needed to provide them with money, property, or valuable skills to make them marriageable. But you couldn't arrange their marriages independently. You needed male relatives or legal guardians to negotiate marriage contracts. Here's the kicker: if you remarried, your new husband gained legal authority over your children from your first marriage. Children he had no blood relationship to. Children who might hate him. Children who represented his stepchildren, not his heirs. Many second husbands saw these stepchildren as competition for family resources. Your son from your first marriage was entitled to his father's inheritance, which meant less wealth for any children you might have with your new husband. Your daughters from your first marriage needed dowries, which meant less money for your second husband's interests. The result? Second husbands who treated their stepchildren like unwanted boarders, who actively worked against the children's interests, who saw every penny spent on their education or welfare as money stolen from the new family, and you were caught in the middle, trying to protect your children while maintaining peace with a husband who had legal authority over all of you. Watching your children resent you for bringing a stranger into their lives, while that stranger resented them for existing. Medieval family therapy was not a thing. But here's what's really heartbreaking. Some widows made impossible choices. They sent their children to live with relatives to protect them from hostile stepfathers. They gave up their parental rights entirely rather than subject their children to abusive situations. Other widows stayed single specifically to protect their children, accepting poverty and social isolation because it was better than remarrying someone who might harm their kids. And some widows discovered that their new husbands were patient predators who had specifically targeted widows with children for reasons that make your skin crawl. Medieval child protection services were also not a thing. Let's get specific about what daily life looked like for a medieval widow trying to survive independently. You wake up before dawn because you have no choice. Every task that your husband used to handle is now your responsibility, plus all the tasks you were already doing. The chickens need feeding, the cow needs milking, the garden needs tending, and the house needs maintaining. But here's the thing, you can't do heavy physical labor the way your husband could. You can't plow fields, repair roofs, or move large pieces of equipment, so you have to hire help for anything requiring significant strength. Hiring help costs money. Money you might not have. Money that every person in your community knows you might not have, so they overcharge you. The man who fixed your husband's plow for the cost of a meal now wants 3 days' wages to fix yours. The neighbor who used to help with harvesting in exchange for mutual labor assistance now demands payment up front, because you're not part of the community reciprocal labor system anymore. You're a customer, and customers get charged market rates. Your husband used to handle all interactions with merchants, guild members, and local officials. He knew the going rates, the seasonal fluctuations, who could be trusted, and who was trying to cheat you. You're learning all of this from scratch while people assume you're an easy target, that grain merchant who gave your husband fair prices. He's suddenly discovered that grain is much more expensive when he's selling it to a woman. The tax collector who was reasonable with your husband. He's now absolutely certain that your property assessment has been undervalued for years. Medieval price discrimination was an art form, and let's talk about protection. Your husband's presence was a deterrent to thieves, aggressive neighbors, and random violence. Not because he was necessarily a great fighter, but because harming a married woman meant dealing with her husband's retaliation and his family's connections. As a widow, you're a softer target. Everyone knows you're alone. Everyone knows you can't retaliate effectively. Everyone knows that if something happens to you, there's no man who's going to come seeking vengeance, so your house gets broken into more often. Your property lines get mysteriously adjusted by neighbors who think you won't fight back. Your animals disappear and everyone assumes you're just bad at counting livestock. Medieval security systems were husband-based. Here's what medieval society never acknowledged. Widows were often the backbone of local economies. They ran shops, managed properties, and provided essential services. But they did it all while operating at a massive disadvantage. Take brewing. Many medieval widows supported themselves by brewing and selling ale. It was one of the few trades women could practice independently, but they faced regulations that married women didn't have to deal with. They had to pay higher licensing fees because they were unsupervised women. They faced more frequent inspections because officials assumed they were more likely to cheat customers. They couldn't easily access credit because they had no male co-signer. And if their ale was judged substandard, the penalties were harsher for widows because courts assumed they were more likely to be repeat offenders without male guidance. Medieval business regulation was definitely not equal opportunity or considered textile work. Spinning, weaving, and sewing were traditional female skills that could provide income. But widows competed against wives who had their husband's financial support and could afford better equipment, higher quality materials, and more time to perfect their craft. A married woman could take on a large weaving project because her husband's income covered living expenses while she worked. A widow needed immediate payment for immediate survival. She couldn't afford to spend months on a high-quality piece that would sell for premium prices. She had to churn out quick, low-margin work just to eat, which meant her reputation as a craftsperson suffered, which meant lower prices, which meant she had to work even faster to survive. It was an economic death spiral disguised as free market competition. Some widows tried to overcome this by partnering with other widows, pooling resources, sharing equipment, specializing in different aspects of production. It was an early form of cooperative economics. Medieval society's response. Laws prohibiting women from forming business partnerships without male oversight. Because women working together was apparently more threatening than women working alone. And here's the really twisted part. Successful independent widows were seen as proof that the system worked. Look, women can survive on their own when they really need to. Never mind that survival came at enormous cost, required exceptional skill and luck, and was constantly threatened by legal and social pressures. The few widows who achieved economic independence became propaganda for a system that was actively trying to prevent their success. Medieval communities ran on gossip, and widows were prime gossip targets. Every action was scrutinized. Every choice was debated. Every relationship was analyzed for evidence of impropriety. You spoke to a man for more than 2 minutes. People started speculating about secret romance. You didn't speak to anyone for several days. Clearly you were up to something suspicious. You improved your property. Obviously you had hidden wealth you weren't declaring to tax collectors. You let your property decline. Evidence that women couldn't manage land without male supervision. The gossip network was simultaneously your enemy and your lifeline. It could destroy your reputation overnight, but it was also how you learned about opportunities, threats, and community news that directly affected your survival. Smart widows learned to navigate this network carefully. They cultivated relationships with key gossip distributors, usually other women who had extensive social connections. They shared just enough personal information to seem trustworthy, without revealing anything that could be used against them. And they learned to plant strategic gossip about their suitors. That elderly widower who's been pressuring you to marry him. Time for the community to hear about his first wife's mysterious death. That young fortune hunter who won't take no for an answer. Interesting how he's been seen gambling away his last few coins. Medieval reputation management was a survival skill. But here's the dark side. The gossip network could also be weaponized against you by people who wanted to force you into marriage. Rumors about improper behavior could make you unmarriageable to respectable men, leaving only the desperate ones. Rumors about financial impropriety could trigger tax investigations. Rumors about religious deviation could bring unwanted attention from church authorities. Your enemies didn't need legal grounds to destroy your life. They just needed the right whispers in the right ears, and once rumors started circulating, they were almost impossible to stop. Medieval communities had long memories and short attention spans for truth. People would remember the gossip, long after they'd forgotten whether it was ever proven accurate. Some widows became experts at counter-gossip warfare, spreading their own strategic rumors to discredit enemies and protect themselves. Others withdrew from community social life entirely, accepting isolation as the price of avoiding gossip-related dangers. Neither strategy was particularly successful long-term. We need to dive deeper into the legal nightmare facing medieval widows, because every aspect of their lives was governed by laws written by men who assumed women needed constant supervision. Property law was particularly insane. Your husband left you a house. You could live in it, but you couldn't sell it without permission from male relatives. You couldn't mortgage it to raise funds. You couldn't even make major repairs without legal approval. The house was simultaneously yours and not yours. You were responsible for maintaining it, paying taxes on it, and defending your claim to it. But you couldn't use it as collateral, couldn't make independent decisions about its management, and couldn't pass it to your children without male oversight. Medieval property ownership was like being given a car with no keys, no title, and no ability to get insurance. Contract law was equally ridiculous. You could enter into some types of contracts independently, but not others. You could buy food at market prices, but you couldn't negotiate payment terms. You could hire day laborers, but you couldn't establish ongoing employment relationships. The dividing line between what contracts you could and couldn't make seemed to be based on medieval lawyers' assumptions about female competence. Simple transactions were fine. Complex negotiations required male supervision, because obviously women could understand the concept of trading money for bread, but the sophisticated concept of trading money for bread delivered weekly was beyond feminine comprehension. Criminal law had its own special horrors for widows. If someone stole from you, the burden of proof was higher than it would have been if you were married. Courts assumed widows were more likely to make false accusations because they were emotionally unstable due to grief. If someone attacked you, the penalties were often lighter because attacking a widow was less serious than attacking someone's wife. Your pain didn't matter as much because you weren't property belonging to a man who could demand justice, and if you defended yourself, that was treated as suspicious behavior. Respectable women were supposed to seek male protection, not handle problems independently. Self-defense was apparently unfeminine. But here's the truly sick part. Some medieval legal codes included special protections for widows. On paper, widows had certain guaranteed rights. In practice, those rights were almost impossible to enforce without significant financial resources and male allies. Your legal rights existed in theory but not in reality. The pressure to remarry wasn't just social expectation. It was a coordinated campaign involving every power structure in medieval society. Your local lord had financial incentives to get you remarried. Unmarried women were harder to control, harder to tax effectively, and represented potential social instability. Lords often maintained lists of available widows and actively match-made to keep their territories well ordered. They would literally summon you to court and present you with marriage options, not suggestions. Requirements: refuse and face fines, property confiscation, or exile from the territory. Medieval speed dating with legal consequences. The church added spiritual pressure. Priests delivered sermons about the dangers of unmarried women. They suggested that prolonged widowhood was spiritually unhealthy, that women needed male guidance to maintain proper relationship with God. They offered prayers for your swift remarriage. They suggested that resistance to marriage was resistance to divine will. They implied that your dead husband would want you to find new happiness. Religious guilt as social engineering. Your extended family contributed to economic pressure. They had to support you financially if you remained unmarried, which affected their own economic stability. They also faced social judgment for having an unmarried woman in the family. So they found creative ways to make independent living impossible. They withdrew financial support gradually until you couldn't survive alone. They spread gossip about your mental stability. They actively sabotaged your attempts at economic independence. Family loyalty had its limits. Even other women participated in the pressure campaign. Married women were taught that unmarried women were threats to their marriages. Widows who remarried quickly were praised and held up as positive examples. Women who resisted remarriage were treated as selfish, stubborn, or mentally unstable by other women who had internalized the idea that female independence was dangerous. Medieval peer pressure was lethal. The result was a society where every institution, every relationship, and every social interaction was designed to make independent widowhood impossible. Not difficult. Impossible. But here's something medieval historians rarely talk about: the underground networks of women who helped each other survive. Some widows formed secret mutual aid societies. They pooled resources, shared information, and provided support for women trying to avoid forced remarriage. These networks operated carefully, communicating through coded messages and clandestine meetings. They developed elaborate systems for hiding wealth from male relatives who wanted to control it. They created false paper trails to make their assets appear less valuable. They established secret saving systems that couldn't be traced or claimed by future husbands. Medieval money laundering, but for survival instead of crime. These networks also provided practical education that women weren't supposed to have. They taught each other about law, business, medicine, and negotiation. They shared knowledge about which local officials could be bribed, which merchants were honest, and which men to avoid. Information was power, and these women hoarded information like weapons. Some networks went further. They actively sabotaged forced marriages by spreading damaging gossip about unwanted suitors. They created false witnesses for legal proceedings. They provided alibis for women who needed to disappear temporarily. They were basically medieval underground resistance movements. The most sophisticated networks maintained safe houses, properties where women could hide while avoiding marriage pressure or escaping abusive situations. These houses were often owned by widows who had successfully achieved independence and were willing to risk everything to help other women, because they understood that independence was only secure if other women could achieve it too. These networks also developed their own informal justice systems. A man who mistreated his wife, the network would ensure his business suffered mysterious setbacks. A male relative who cheated a widow out of her inheritance, his property might experience unfortunate accidents. Medieval karma was a group effort, but operating these networks required enormous risk. Discovery meant social exile, property confiscation, or worse. Many women who participated were taking huge gambles with their own security to help others. The fact that they did it anyway tells you everything about how desperate the situation really was. Despite everything, some medieval widows achieved remarkable independence and success. Their stories are worth telling because they show both what was possible and how extraordinary it was. Take Marjorie Kempe, a 14th century English widow who became one of the first known female authors. After her husband's death, she refused remarriage, started her own brewing business, and eventually embarked on religious pilgrimages across Europe. She wrote extensively about her experiences and became a respected spiritual figure, but her success came at enormous cost. She was repeatedly accused of heresy, constantly questioned by religious authorities, and socially ostracized for refusing to conform to expectations about feminine behavior. Or consider the medieval businesswoman Christine de Pizan, who became one of the first professional female writers after her husband's death left her with 3 children to support. She wrote prolifically about women's rights, argued against misogyny, and created what might be the first feminist literature, but she had to frame her arguments carefully to avoid accusations of impropriety. She wrote about women's capabilities while constantly acknowledging male authority to avoid being branded as a dangerous radical. Then there were the merchant widows who took over their husbands' businesses and expanded them into commercial empires. Women like Rose of Burford, who inherited a wool trading business and turned it into one of the most successful operations in 14th century England. But even these successful women faced constant legal challenges. Male competitors regularly sued them, claiming women couldn't legally operate businesses independently. They had to maintain extensive legal teams and political connections just to keep functioning. The most remarkable success stories involved widows who used the system's own contradictions against it. They would deliberately marry much older men, wait for them to die, inherit their wealth, then use that wealth to purchase independence from future marriage obligations. Some women did this multiple times, becoming serial widows who accumulated property and power through strategic marriages followed by strategic widowhood. It sounds cynical, but it was often the only path to real autonomy. Medieval game theory in action. But here's the thing about these success stories: they required exceptional intelligence, incredible luck, powerful connections, and often morally questionable choices. They weren't examples of how the system worked. They were examples of how some extraordinary women managed to survive despite the system. For every Marjorie Kempe, there were thousands of widows who died in poverty. For every Christine de Pizan, there were countless women whose stories were never recorded because they didn't achieve enough success to be worth remembering. The exceptions proved the rule. Medieval widowhood was designed to be unsurvivable. We've been talking about widowhood, as if all medieval women faced the same challenges. They didn't. Class made an enormous difference in how widowhood was experienced. Noble widows faced different pressures than peasant widows, but not necessarily better ones. A noble widow inherited significant wealth and property, but she also inherited political obligations that came with that wealth. Her remarriage wasn't just personal choice, it was international relations. Her property wasn't just an economic resource, it was strategic territory. Kings and lords had strong opinions about who noble widows should marry, because those marriages affected military alliances, trade relationships, and political stability. A noble widow who wanted to remain unmarried wasn't just defying social convention, she was potentially destabilizing regional politics. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, was forced into her second marriage to Henry II of England. Despite being one of the wealthiest landowners on the continent, her personal preferences were irrelevant compared to the political advantages her marriage would provide. Noble widows also faced kidnapping and forced marriage more frequently than peasant widows, because the stakes were higher. If you could abduct and forcibly marry a wealthy widow, you instantly gained access to her lands and titles. Medieval kidnapping was a legitimate business strategy. Merchant-class widows had their own unique challenges. They often inherited complex businesses that required immediate attention, but they lacked the legal authority to make major business decisions independently. Their husband's business partners might refuse to honor contracts with a woman. Their suppliers might demand immediate payment instead of extending credit. Their customers might take their business elsewhere, rather than deal with female management. A successful merchant widow had to prove her competence repeatedly while operating under constant scrutiny from male competitors who were looking for any excuse to claim she was mismanaging the business. But peasant widows faced the most brutal realities. They had fewer resources to buy legal protection, fewer social connections to provide support, and fewer options for economic survival. A peasant widow might lose access to the land she'd worked her entire life because it belonged to the lord who leased it to her husband. She might be forced to remarry the first man who would take her, regardless of his character, just to avoid starvation. Peasant widows were also more likely to face accusations of witchcraft because they were vulnerable targets who couldn't afford legal defense. If crops failed or animals died mysteriously, the local widow was a convenient scapegoat. Class privilege could provide some protection from the worst aspects of medieval widowhood, but it couldn't eliminate them entirely. Every widow, regardless of social status, faced the fundamental problem of being a woman in a legal system designed by and for men. Medieval widows had to navigate not just social and legal challenges, but seasonal survival cycles that could determine whether they lived or died. Winter was the most dangerous season. Fuel was expensive, food was scarce, and physical labor was limited by weather conditions. A widow who hadn't prepared adequately during harvest season might not survive until spring. But winter preparation required significant resources that many widows didn't have. You needed money to buy extra grain, wood for fuel, and warm clothing. You needed storage space that was secure from theft. You needed the physical capacity to preserve food and maintain heating systems. Many widows spent the entire growing season calculating whether they would have enough resources to survive the next winter. It was an annual life or death math problem. Spring brought different challenges. This was when widows needed to make major decisions about planting crops, repairing winter damage to buildings, and planning for the year ahead. But spring was also when they were most financially depleted from winter survival expenses, so they had to make crucial investments when they could least afford them. Plant enough crops to ensure next winter's survival, but with seed money they didn't really have. Repair buildings that might be too expensive to fix properly. Make business decisions about the coming year while operating from a position of financial weakness. Summer was theoretically the easiest season, but it brought its own pressures. This was when most marriages took place, which meant maximum pressure to remarry. This was when communities held their major festivals and gatherings, which meant maximum social scrutiny of unmarried women. Summer was also when widows needed to work hardest to prepare for winter. Long daylight hours meant maximum productivity, but also maximum physical demands on women who might already be stretched to their limits. Harvest season was make or break time. A good harvest could mean survival for another year. A poor harvest could mean forced remarriage, destitution, or death. But harvest success wasn't just about weather and farming skill. It was about having enough labor to get crops harvested efficiently, enough storage to preserve food properly, and enough security to protect stored food from theft. A widow managing harvest alone was at enormous disadvantage compared to married couples who could share labor and coordinate activities. Many widows formed seasonal labor partnerships with other widows, trading work during crucial times of year. But these partnerships were informal and vulnerable to dissolution if one partner remarried or died. The seasonal cycle meant that medieval widowhood wasn't a stable condition. It was a series of annual survival challenges that became progressively more difficult as women aged and their physical capacity declined. Let's talk about what happened when medieval widows got sick or injured, because medical care was yet another system designed around male authority and female dependency. Most medical knowledge was controlled by male physicians who had been trained in universities that didn't admit women. These physicians charged fees that many widows couldn't afford and often refused to treat unmarried women without male accompaniment. because obviously a woman couldn't accurately describe her own symptoms without male interpretation. For basic medical care, widows relied on female healers, midwives, herb women, and folk healers who learned through apprenticeship and experience rather than formal education. But these women operated in legal grey areas and faced constant suspicion of witchcraft. If a widow's treatment was successful, the female healer might gain a reputation that attracted more clients. If the treatment failed, the healer might face accusations of deliberate harm or supernatural malevolence. Medieval medical malpractice suits were witch trials. Widows also faced unique health challenges related to their social situation. Chronic stress from financial insecurity, poor nutrition from limited resources, and physical exhaustion from handling all labor independently took severe tolls on their health. Depression and anxiety were common, but completely misunderstood. Medieval medicine had no concept of mental health as distinct from moral or spiritual problems. A depressed widow was assumed to be spiritually weak or morally deficient. The prescribed treatments were prayer, confession, and marriage, because obviously what a grieving, stressed woman needed was another husband to worry about. Reproductive health issues were particularly problematic for widows. Pregnancy outside marriage was a social and legal disaster, but widows still had sexual needs and desires that society pretended didn't exist. Contraception was primitive, unreliable, and often dangerous. Abortion was illegal and potentially lethal, but unmarried pregnancy could result in social exile, property confiscation, or even execution for adultery. Medieval reproductive choices were all terrible. As widows aged, they faced health problems that required ongoing care but had no family structure to provide it. Adult children might have their own families to support. Male relatives might be unwilling to bear the expense of caring for elderly women who couldn't contribute economically. Many elderly widows ended up in primitive poorhouses or religious institutions that provided basic shelter in exchange for whatever property they had left. These institutions were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and run by people who saw residents as burdens rather than human beings deserving care. Medieval end-of-life care was mostly about waiting to die with minimal resources and maximum discomfort. The experience of medieval widowhood varied significantly across different regions and cultures, but the fundamental pattern of female dependency remained consistent. Islamic widows had to observe waiting periods before remarrying, but these periods were designed to ensure proper paternity for any children rather than to provide time for grief or decision-making. In Byzantine territories, widows could join religious communities more easily than in Western Europe, but this often meant giving up all worldly possessions and contact with their children. The choice was between independence through poverty and religious isolation, or dependence through remarriage and continued vulnerability. In Scandinavian regions, some evidence suggests widows had slightly more economic freedoms, particularly in trade and craft production. But even these relatively progressive societies expected remarriage and viewed prolonged widowhood as problematic. The variation wasn't in whether societies controlled women's lives after their husbands died. The variation was in the specific methods used to maintain that control. Some cultures used religious pressure more heavily. Others relied more on economic coercion. Some used legal restrictions while others employed social ostracism. But every culture had systems in place to prevent women from achieving genuine independence after widowhood. The universality of these restrictions suggests they weren't accidental cultural quirks. They were deliberate strategies for maintaining male control over property, reproduction, and social organization. Medieval societies understood that independent women posed a threat to patriarchal structures. Widowhood represented a potential crack in the system where women might glimpse what autonomy could look like. So every society developed elaborate mechanisms to seal those cracks as quickly as possible. We need to talk more about how the medieval church systematically exploited widows while pretending to protect them. The church taught that widows occupied a special spiritual position closer to God through suffering, purified by loss, and capable of deeper religious devotion than married women who were distracted by worldly concerns. This sounds respectful until you realize it was a justification for extracting wealth from vulnerable women. Churches developed elaborate systems for encouraging widows to donate property in exchange for prayers for their dead husbands' souls. The more you gave, the more prayers you could purchase, and the faster your husband would escape purgatory. Medieval spiritual commerce was remarkably sophisticated. Widows were told that keeping wealth for their own survival was selfish when their husbands were suffering in the afterlife. They were encouraged to sell property, spend inheritances, and give up security to fund prayers, masses, and church construction projects. The church presented this as a spiritual opportunity. In reality, it was systematic financial abuse of grieving women. Churches also established special religious orders for widows who wanted to avoid remarriage. These orders required members to give up all worldly possessions, live in poverty, and dedicate their lives to prayer and service. Joining meant safety from forced remarriage, but it also meant giving up any possibility of independent life, contact with children, or personal autonomy. Medieval religious life was a prison disguised as protection. Some churches went further and actively participated in forcing widows to remarry by refusing sacraments to unmarried women, spreading gossip about their moral character, or even claiming their resistance to marriage was evidence of heretical beliefs. Priests would use confession to pressure widows into accepting marriage proposals. They would refuse to perform funerals for family members unless widows agreed to consider remarriage. They would suggest that prolonged grief was a sign of insufficient faith in God's plan. Religious authority was another tool for social control. But here's the really sick part. The same churches that profited from exploiting widows also produced extensive theological literature about the virtue of caring for widows and orphans. Medieval Christianity talked constantly about protecting the vulnerable while systematically victimizing them. The disconnect wasn't accidental, it was strategic. By claiming moral authority over widow welfare, churches could control the narrative about what constituted proper care, while ensuring that care always involved transferring wealth and independence to male-controlled institutions. Medieval courts were supposed to provide justice for widows who were cheated out of inheritances, threatened by predatory suitors, or victimized by corrupt officials. In practice, medieval justice was for sale, and widows were rarely the highest bidders. Local lords who administered justice often had financial relationships with the men who were cheating widows. They owed political favors, business partnerships, or family loyalty to exactly the people widows needed protection from. A widow who brought a legal complaint against her husband's brother for stealing her inheritance was asking a male judge to rule against a male defendant in favor of a female plaintiff who had no political connections and limited resources. Medieval justice was not blind. It was specifically designed to see gender and class. Court fees were structured in ways that made justice expensive for widows. You had to pay to file complaints, pay for legal representation, pay for witnesses, and pay for document preparation. Poor widows couldn't afford justice. Wealthy widows could afford it, but might bankrupt themselves pursuing it. And even if you won your case, enforcement was another problem entirely. A court might rule that your husband's brother had to return your property, but if he ignored the ruling, you had to pay for additional legal action to force compliance. Medieval court victories were often meaningless without the resources to enforce them. Judges also had enormous discretion in interpreting laws, and their interpretations almost invariably favored male defendants over female plaintiffs. Even when law was clearly on a widow's side, judges would find technical reasons to rule against her. The legal system that was supposed to protect widows was another mechanism for victimizing them. Some widows tried to work around this by hiring male relatives to represent their interests in court. But male representatives often had their own agendas and might negotiate settlements that benefited them more than the widows they were supposed to help. Your legal advocate might be working against your interests while claiming to protect them. The most corrupt judges actively solicited bribes from men who wanted to force widows into marriage or steal their property. They would rule against widows in exchange for political support, financial payments, or business opportunities. Medieval legal corruption was institutionalized. Beyond the economic and legal pressures, medieval widows faced sophisticated psychological warfare designed to break their resistance to remarriage and social control. The community constantly reminded them that they were incomplete without husbands. Every social interaction reinforced the message that independent women were unnatural, dangerous, and ultimately doomed to failure. Children were taught to pity widows, not respect them. They learned that widowed mothers were tragic figures who needed rescue by male relatives. This meant that even a widow's own children might join the campaign to pressure her into remarriage. Medieval psychology was remarkably advanced when it came to breaking women's spirits. Widows were excluded from social events that were considered appropriate only for married couples. They were seated separately at communal meals, excluded from decision-making discussions, and treated as temporary community members who would hopefully be properly integrated through remarriage soon. Social isolation was used as a weapon to make independence unbearable. The community also engaged in deliberate gaslighting, constantly questioning widows' decision-making capacity, memory, and emotional stability. Any choice a widow made that preserved her independence was presented as evidence that she was too grief-stricken to think clearly. If she refused a marriage proposal, she was obviously still too devastated by loss to make rational decisions. If she made successful business decisions, she was probably getting inappropriate advice from men who were taking advantage of her vulnerability. Medieval society had mastered the art of making women doubt their own competence. Religious leaders contributed by suggesting that resistance to remarriage was resistance to God's will. They implied that widows who wanted to remain independent were spiritually proud, insufficiently humble, and possibly influenced by demonic forces. Spiritual manipulation was standard practice. Even other women participated in psychological pressure campaigns. Married women would constantly share stories about the dangers facing unmarried women, the loneliness of independent life, and the security that came with having male protection. They weren't necessarily trying to be cruel. They had internalized the same messages about female dependency and genuinely believed they were helping by encouraging remarriage. But the effect was to create a society where every conversation, every social interaction, and every community event reinforced the message that independent widowhood was impossible, dangerous, and morally questionable. The psychological pressure was relentless and came from every direction simultaneously. Medieval communities developed sophisticated networks for extracting wealth from widows through seemingly legitimate business transactions. Local merchants would form informal cartels that charged widows higher prices for essential goods. Since widows couldn't easily travel to distant markets or had limited knowledge of fair pricing, they could be overcharged systematically without obvious criminality. The baker, the miller, the blacksmith, and the cloth merchant would all coordinate to inflate prices for widow customers while maintaining competitive rates for male customers who might retaliate or organize boycotts. Medieval price fixing was gender-specific. Moneylenders developed special loan terms for widows that appeared generous but included hidden clauses that made repayment nearly impossible. They would offer emergency credit during harvest failures or family crises, then use the resulting debt to claim property when widows inevitably defaulted. These weren't random individual crimes. They were organized systems for transferring property from widows to male community members through manufactured financial crises. Medieval predatory lending was an art form. Labor contractors would systematically underpay widows for piecework while claiming that female labor was inherently worth less than male labor. They would reject completed work for trivial quality issues, refuse to pay agreed-upon rates, and delay payment until widows became desperate enough to accept reduced compensation. Since widows had limited legal recourse and needed immediate income for survival, they had little choice but to accept exploitation as the cost of earning anything at all. property maintenance became another exploitation opportunity. The men who provided essential services like roof repair, well cleaning, and boundary maintenance would quote inflated prices to widows while providing substandard work that required frequent expensive repairs. They understood that widows lacked the technical knowledge to evaluate their work quality and couldn't easily find alternative service providers in small communities. Medieval home repair scams were routine. Even charitable organizations developed systems for extracting widow wealth. Religious institutions would offer to manage widow property in exchange for prayer services, then use their management authority to divert resources to other purposes while providing minimal actual assistance. Charity was another form of property theft disguised as community support. The most sophisticated exploitation involved creating artificial crises that required immediate expensive solutions. Community members would damage widow property, then offer to sell repair services. They would spread rumors about legal threats, then offer expensive legal protection. They would create problems they could profit from solving. Medieval disaster capitalism was remarkably advanced. Despite everything we've discussed, some medieval widows developed remarkable resistance networks that challenged the systems designed to control them. These networks operated through coded language, secret meetings, and carefully coordinated mutual aid that flew under the radar of male community leaders. Widows would develop signals to warn each other about dangerous suitors, corrupt officials, and predatory merchants. They would share information about which legal strategies worked, which judges could be trusted, and which escape routes existed for women in crisis situations. Information was their most powerful weapon against systematic oppression. Some networks went beyond mutual aid and engaged in active sabotage of men who victimized women. They would coordinate to destroy the reputations of abusive husbands, predatory suitors, and corrupt officials through strategic gossip campaigns. They understood that social reputation was crucial for male economic and political success, so they weaponized community judgment against their oppressors. Medieval culture was pioneered by oppressed women. The most sophisticated networks maintained informal banking systems that allowed widows to hide wealth from male relatives and potential husbands. They would create false ownership records, establish secret savings accounts, and develop complex lending arrangements that were invisible to official authorities. These women were essentially running underground economies that operated parallel to official financial systems. Some networks established secret training programs where older widows taught younger ones essential survival skills that women weren't supposed to have. They shared knowledge about law, business negotiation, property management, and self-defense. They understood that ignorance was a tool of oppression, so they fought back with education. The most radical networks engaged in what we might recognize today as feminist political organizing. They developed systematic critiques of laws and customs that oppressed women, and they worked to create alternative social arrangements that respected female autonomy. They couldn't change the legal system directly, but they could create shadow communities where different rules applied. These networks also maintained safe houses and escape routes for women fleeing forced marriages, abusive situations, or legal persecution. They developed complex communication systems for coordinating rescues and hiding refugees. Medieval underground railroads existed centuries before the ones we learn about in history class, but operating these networks required enormous personal risk. Discovery could mean property confiscation, social exile, accusations of witchcraft, or worse. Many women who participated were gambling their own security to help others survive. The fact that they did it anyway tells us everything about how desperate the situation was and how powerful the human drive for justice can be. Here's something most people don't know. Medieval Europe had an active international trade in widows that operated through marriage brokers, political alliances, and economic networks. Wealthy widows with valuable property were essentially commodities that could be traded between regions to cement political relationships or create economic opportunities for male relatives and political allies. A French widow might find herself pressured to marry an English lord to strengthen diplomatic ties. An Italian widow's property might be used to secure trade agreements with German merchants. A Spanish widow could be married off to create military alliances with Portuguese nobles. Medieval international relations were conducted through female bodies and property. Marriage brokers operated networks that spanned multiple countries, maintaining detailed records of available widows, their assets, their family connections, and their political value. These brokers earned commissions from successful matches and had financial incentives to complete transactions quickly. They weren't matchmakers, they were human traffickers operating with legal sanction. Some widows were literally kidnapped and transported across national boundaries for forced marriages to men they had never met. Since women had no independent legal standing in international law, these kidnappings were often treated as legitimate business transactions rather than crimes. Medieval human trafficking was international big business. The most valuable widows were those who controlled strategic properties like ports, mining rights, or trade routes. Their remarriages could shift the balance of economic power between regions, so they faced pressure not just from local communities but from foreign governments. Being a strategically important widow was like being a chess piece in games played by people who didn't care whether you lived or died. Even less wealthy widows might find themselves targeted by foreign marriage schemes. Men from distant regions would specifically seek out widows because they were seen as easier targets than unmarried women who might have family protection. Foreign husbands had the additional advantage of isolating their wives completely from any existing support networks, making resistance even more difficult. Medieval mail-order bride systems were pioneer widow exploitation. Some regions developed reputations as sources for vulnerable widows, and others became known as destinations where men could acquire wives with minimal legal oversight. This created migration patterns that were essentially organized trafficking disguised as marriage facilitation. International law provided no protection for women caught in these systems because women weren't considered to have rights that transcended national boundaries. Medieval societies developed remarkably sophisticated technologies for controlling widows that went far beyond simple legal restrictions. Architecture itself was designed to enforce female dependency. Houses were built with single entries that could be easily monitored, minimal storage space for independent wealth accumulation, and layouts that made privacy impossible. Widow housing was specifically designed to make independent living difficult and remarriage attractive. Clothing regulations served as social control mechanisms. Widows were required to wear specific garments that identified their marital status, made them easily recognizable in public, and signaled their availability for remarriage. These weren't just fashion choices, they were legal requirements enforced through fines and social ostracism. Medieval identity cards were sewn into your clothing. Economic systems were structured to make female independence mathematically impossible. Guild membership, property ownership, and business licensing were restricted in ways that ensured women couldn't accumulate enough wealth to achieve genuine autonomy. The economy was deliberately designed to maintain female dependency. Religious calendar systems reinforced social control by scheduling major community events around male authority. Harvest festivals, religious ceremonies, and seasonal celebrations all emphasized the importance of male-headed households and the abnormality of independent women. Even time itself was organized around patriarchal assumptions. Educational systems ensured that women remained ignorant of the knowledge necessary for independence. They were taught domestic skills but not reading, basic crafts but not business management, religious obedience but not legal rights. Ignorance was systematically maintained as a tool of oppression. Communication networks were structured to prevent women from organizing effectively. Information about legal rights, economic opportunities, and political changes was distributed through male-dominated channels that women couldn't access independently. Knowledge distribution was gender-segregated to maintain male advantage. Even medical knowledge was controlled to reinforce female dependency. Women were taught to believe they were inherently physically and mentally weaker than men, more susceptible to illness, and incapable of making rational decisions about their own health care. Medieval medicine was as much about social control as healing. The sophistication of these control systems suggests they weren't accidental cultural developments. They were deliberately designed and carefully maintained technologies for ensuring that female independence remained impossible regardless of individual circumstances. Let's talk about what happened to widows who gave up and accepted the systems designed to control them. Because compliance came with its own set of devastating costs. Widows who remarried quickly to avoid social pressure often found themselves in marriages that were worse than their first ones. Second husbands understood they were marriages of convenience and felt no obligation to treat their wives with respect or kindness. Many second marriages were essentially legalized domestic servitude arrangements where widows traded their independence for basic survival while receiving minimal consideration in return. Medieval marriage counseling was not available. Widows who donated their property to churches to avoid family conflicts often discovered that religious institutions were no more reliable than male relatives. Churches would accept donations gratefully but provide minimal actual support, leaving formerly wealthy women destitute while enriching clerical organizations. Religious charity flowed in one direction only. Widows who accepted family control over their lives often found that their sacrifice didn't guarantee security. Male relatives who promised to provide support might change their minds, face their own financial crises, or simply decide that supporting dependent women was too expensive. Family loyalty had expiration dates. The psychological cost of compliance was enormous. Women who submitted to systems they knew were unjust often developed what we might recognize today as depression, anxiety, and learned helplessness. They lost faith in their own judgment, stopped advocating for their needs, and accepted progressively worse treatment as normal. Medieval mental health care was prayer and submission. Compliant widows also faced the devastating realization that their sacrifice didn't protect their children. Sons might inherit property but treat their mothers as burdens. Daughters might receive dowries but end up in abusive marriages that their mothers couldn't prevent. Maternal sacrifice often protected no one. Many compliant widows spent their final years recognizing that they had given up their independence for security that never materialized. They had traded their autonomy for promises that weren't kept and protection that didn't exist. The tragic irony was that compliance was often more dangerous than resistance because it eliminated the possibility of building alternative support systems or developing survival skills. Women who fought the system at least maintained their agency and problem-solving abilities. Women who submitted often lost both their independence and their capacity for self-protection. The systematic oppression of medieval widows created long-term consequences that extended far beyond individual suffering and shaped the development of Western society for centuries. The legal precedents established during the medieval period became the foundation for later laws that continued to restrict women's rights well into the modern era. Coverture laws persisted into the 19th century. Property restrictions continued into the 20th century. The assumption that women needed male supervision influenced legal systems for nearly 1,000 years. Medieval widow oppression was the prototype for systematic gender discrimination. The economic systems that extracted wealth from widows established patterns of female economic vulnerability that became deeply embedded in Western capitalism. Women's labor was systematically undervalued, their property rights were restricted, and their economic independence was actively prevented through legal and social mechanisms. These patterns didn't disappear when medieval society ended. They evolved into more sophisticated forms of economic discrimination that persisted for centuries. The religious justifications developed to control medieval widows became theological foundations for later restrictions on women's spiritual authority, educational opportunities, and social participation. Medieval religious misogyny became institutionalized doctrine that influenced Christian teachings about gender roles for nearly a millennium. The psychological warfare techniques used against medieval widows became templates for later systems of social control. The combination of legal restriction, economic pressure, social isolation, and spiritual manipulation, was refined and applied to other groups that threatened existing power structures. Medieval widow oppression was a pilot program for systematic social control. The resistance networks developed by medieval widows also had long-term consequences. They created traditions of female mutual aid, underground education, and political organizing that persisted across centuries and eventually contributed to organized women's rights movements. Medieval feminist resistance was the foundation for later liberation movements. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence was the normalization of male authority over female autonomy. Medieval widow oppression established the idea that women couldn't be trusted with independence, that female autonomy was inherently dangerous, and that male control was natural and necessary. These assumptions became so deeply embedded in Western culture that they continued to influence social attitudes, legal systems, and economic structures long after the specific medieval institutions had disappeared. We're still dealing with the legacy of medieval widow oppression today. One of the most disturbing aspects of medieval widow oppression was how effectively it was hidden from historical records. Most medieval historians were male clergy who had participated in the systems that oppressed widows. They weren't likely to document their own participation in systematic abuse. Official records focused on legal transactions, property transfers, and political events. They rarely recorded the human cost of these transactions or the resistance efforts that challenged them. Medieval history was written by the oppressors, not the victims. When widows were mentioned in official records, they were usually described in ways that justified their treatment rather than documenting their experiences. They were protected rather than controlled, guided rather than manipulated, cared for rather than exploited. Medieval propaganda was embedded in the historical record itself. The few records that documented widow resistance were often framed as evidence of mental instability, spiritual corruption, or moral degeneracy. Women who fought back were portrayed as cautionary tales rather than heroes. Medieval historical narrative was designed to discourage resistance by making it appear futile and destructive. Even when modern historians began to recognize the systematic oppression of medieval women, they often focused on exceptional cases rather than the routine experiences of ordinary widows. They wrote about queens and nobles who achieved some measure of independence while ignoring the vast majority of women who suffered in obscurity. Historical scholarship has often perpetuated the myth that medieval gender oppression was less systematic than it actually was. The result is that most people today have no idea how sophisticated and brutal medieval widow oppression actually was. They assume that gender discrimination was a matter of individual prejudice rather than systematic institutional design. This historical amnesia serves the interests of people who want to minimize the significance of gender-based oppression and suggests that current gender inequalities are natural rather than the result of centuries of deliberate social engineering. Understanding the true history of medieval widow oppression is crucial for recognizing how gender-based discrimination operates and why it has been so persistent across different historical periods and cultural contexts. The systems that oppressed medieval widows were prototypes for later forms of gender discrimination that continue to affect women today. Before we conclude, we need to acknowledge the uncomfortable parallels between medieval widow oppression and modern gender-based discrimination. The assumption that women need male protection and guidance didn't disappear with medieval society. It evolved into more subtle forms that continue to influence legal systems, economic structures, and social expectations. Modern divorce laws, inheritance practices, and property rights still reflect medieval assumptions about female dependency and male authority. The economic systems that made medieval widow independence impossible have modern equivalents in wage discrimination, occupational segregation, and the systematic undervaluation of women's labor. Medieval widows couldn't accumulate wealth because of legal restrictions. Modern women face statistical disadvantages in wealth accumulation because of structural economic discrimination. The social pressure that forced medieval widows into unwanted relationships has modern parallels in cultural expectations about female partnership, family responsibilities, and social roles. Women today still face social judgment for remaining single, choosing career over family, or prioritizing personal autonomy over relationship obligations. The psychological warfare used against medieval widows, modernists questioning their competence, undermining their confidence, and suggesting they need male guidance, modernists saying they need male guidance, continues in more subtle forms through media representation, workplace discrimination, and interpersonal relationships. Modern gaslighting has medieval precedents. The legal systems that failed to protect medieval widows from exploitation have modern equivalents in justice systems that systematically undervalue crimes against women, family courts that fail to protect victims of domestic violence, and corporate legal systems that minimize sexual harassment and discrimination. Medieval legal inequality evolved rather than disappearing. The religious institutions that exploited medieval widows while claiming to protect them have modern parallels in organizations that profit from gender-based inequality while promoting themselves as supportive of women's rights. Medieval religious hypocrisy has institutional descendants. Even the resistance networks developed by medieval widows have modern equivalents in feminist organizations, mutual aid societies, and informal support systems that help women navigate systemic discrimination. The struggle for female autonomy has continued across centuries because the systems that restrict it have also continued, albeit in evolved forms. There's something we haven't talked about yet. The widows who simply couldn't take it anymore. Medieval records occasionally mention women who disappeared without explanation. Widows who were there one day and gone the next, leaving behind property, children, and entire lives. Official records usually assumed they had died or been abducted, but some evidence suggests these were deliberate escapes. Some widows chose exile over submission. These women walked away from everything they had ever known, rather than accept the systems designed to control them. They became wanderers, beggars, or hermits living on the margins of society. They chose poverty and danger over safety purchased through dependence. Medieval society had no category for understanding women who chose freedom over security, so these women essentially disappeared from history. They became invisible, which might have been exactly what they wanted. Other widows chose more dramatic forms of resistance. Some engaged in deliberate property destruction, burning down their own houses rather than letting male relatives inherit them. Others engaged in public acts of defiance that led to social exile or legal punishment. If the system was going to destroy them anyway, they decided to go out on their own terms. The most tragic cases involved widows who chose death over continued oppression. Medieval suicide rates among widows were significantly higher than among other demographic groups, but these deaths were usually attributed to grief rather than recognized as protests against systematic injustice. When the only choices are submission or death, some people choose death. But here's what's remarkable: even in extremis, these women were making autonomous choices. They were exercising the one form of power that nobody could take away from them: the power to refuse participation in systems designed to exploit them. Medieval society tried to control every aspect of women's lives, but they couldn't control the fundamental human capacity for resistance. These stories are heartbreaking, but they're also evidence of something powerful. They prove that the human desire for autonomy and dignity is stronger than any system designed to crush it. Medieval widows who chose death over submission weren't victims. They were revolutionaries using the only weapon left to them. The widows who survived and achieved some measure of independence developed wisdom that's worth preserving. Their strategies for navigating impossible situations offer insights that remain relevant today. They learned that survival sometimes required strategic deception. They became experts at appearing compliant while secretly maintaining control over their lives. They developed elaborate performances of feminine helplessness that allowed them to operate with minimal interference. Medieval women pioneered what we might recognize today as strategic femininity, using social expectations about female behavior to create space for autonomous action. They understood that direct confrontation was usually futile, so they developed indirect methods for achieving their goals. They learned to work through intermediaries, to plant ideas in other people's minds, and to achieve outcomes without taking visible credit for them. Medieval women were the original behind-the-scenes power brokers. They discovered the importance of economic literacy and spent enormous effort learning about property law, business practices, and financial management, despite being excluded from formal education in these areas. They understood that ignorance was vulnerability and self-education was survival. They developed sophisticated risk assessment skills, learning to evaluate potential husbands, business partners, and allies based on evidence rather than promises. They became experts at reading people's motivations and predicting their behavior. Medieval widows were professional character analyzers. They learned to value female friendships and mutual aid networks as essential survival tools. They understood that isolation was death and community was life, even when that community had to operate in secret. They pioneered collective action strategies that would be recognizable to modern feminist organizers. They developed remarkable psychological resilience, learning to maintain their sense of self-worth despite living in societies that constantly told them they were worthless. They found ways to preserve their dignity and autonomy, even in situations designed to destroy both. Medieval women were the original practitioners of what we might call radical self-care. Most importantly, they never fully internalized the messages about female inferiority that surrounded them. Even when they had to perform submission for safety, they maintained inner knowledge of their own competence and worth. This psychological resistance was perhaps their greatest achievement. One of the most remarkable aspects of medieval widow resistance was how some women used religious arguments to challenge the systems oppressing them. They pointed out that Christianity taught the equality of souls before God, which contradicted earthly systems that treated women as inferior beings. They argued that if women had equal spiritual value, earthly restrictions on their autonomy were actually anti-Christian. Medieval feminist theology was born in widow communities. Some widows developed elaborate theological arguments for why remaining unmarried was spiritually superior to remarriage. They cited biblical passages about the virtue of widowhood and the spiritual advantages of undivided attention to God. They turned religious pressure for remarriage back on itself by claiming that remarriage was actually spiritually inferior. Others argued that male authority over women was a consequence of the fall rather than part of God's original design. They suggested that redemption through Christ restored the spiritual equality that had existed before sin corrupted human relationships. Medieval women were developing what we would recognize today as liberation theology. The most radical theological arguments suggested that male-dominated religious institutions had corrupted Christ's original teachings about gender equality. These women claimed that true Christianity supported female autonomy and that church opposition to widow independence was heretical. This was dangerous territory that could lead to accusations of heresy and execution, but some women pursued these arguments anyway. They established informal religious communities that operated outside official church control, developing their own interpretations of scripture and their own spiritual practices that affirmed female worth and autonomy. Medieval women were creating alternative religious institutions centuries before the Protestant Reformation. These theological innovations had limited immediate impact because they were developed by marginalized women who lacked institutional power, but they preserved important ideas about gender equality that would eventually contribute to broader religious and social reforms. Medieval widow theology was a precursor to later feminist religious movements. The fact that women developed these sophisticated theological arguments while living under extreme oppression demonstrates remarkable intellectual courage and creativity. They refused to accept religious justifications for their oppression and instead used religious arguments to challenge that oppression. The most sophisticated medieval widow resistance involved creating parallel economic systems that operated outside male-controlled institutions. These women developed informal banking networks that allowed them to hide wealth, transfer resources, and provide financial services to other women without involving male-controlled financial institutions. They created what amounted to shadow economies that were invisible to official record-keeping. Some widows established complex trust arrangements where property was technically owned by male relatives or allies, but actually controlled by the women who had created the wealth. These arrangements allowed them to maintain effective control over resources while appearing to comply with legal restrictions. Medieval women pioneered modern trust law centuries before it was officially recognized. Others developed sophisticated barter systems that allowed them to exchange goods and services without using official currency that could be tracked or controlled by male authorities. These systems created substantial wealth that was completely invisible to official economic monitoring. Medieval alternative economies were remarkably advanced. The most ambitious projects involved creating female-controlled production cooperatives that manufactured goods, provided services, and distributed products through networks that bypassed male-controlled commercial systems. These cooperatives operated across regional boundaries and maintained complex supply chains that would be recognizable to modern business analysts. They established quality control standards, marketing strategies, and customer service practices that were often superior to those of male-controlled businesses. Medieval women were creating successful business models while being legally prohibited from engaging in business. Some of these economic networks persisted for decades or even centuries, passing from generation to generation of women who maintained the systems while adding their own innovations and improvements. They created institutional knowledge about female economic cooperation that was preserved through informal education systems that operated parallel to official male-controlled educational institutions. The sophistication and longevity of these economic networks demonstrate that medieval women were capable of remarkable organizational and business achievements when they had the opportunity to operate independently. They weren't economically incompetent beings who needed male supervision. They were skilled entrepreneurs who created successful businesses despite systematic legal and social obstacles. Medieval widow resistance created cultural legacies that persisted long after the specific medieval institutions had disappeared. Folk tales and songs that celebrated independent women often had origins in stories about widows who successfully resisted social pressure to remarry. These stories preserved important cultural knowledge about female resistance strategies and celebrated female autonomy at times when such celebration was dangerous. Medieval feminist literature was disguised as entertainment. Traditional crafts and trades that became associated with female expertise often originated in skills that widows developed for economic survival. Many textile techniques, food preservation methods, and household management strategies were refined by women who had to become experts at independent living. Medieval women's economic contributions were preserved through cultural transmission even when they were erased from official records. Religious practices that emphasized female spiritual authority often had roots in the alternative religious communities established by medieval widows. Many mystical traditions, healing practices, and spiritual techniques were developed by women who were creating religious alternatives to male-dominated institutions. Medieval women's spirituality influenced religious development for centuries. Social customs that supported female friendship and mutual aid networks often originated in the support systems that medieval widows created for survival. These customs preserved important knowledge about female cooperation and collective action that would later contribute to organized women's rights movements. Medieval sisterhood was institutionalized through cultural practices. Even architectural and design traditions sometimes reflected innovations developed by widows who needed to create safe and functional living spaces while operating under legal and economic constraints. Medieval women's contributions to material culture were substantial but often unrecognized. Language itself was influenced by medieval widow experiences. Many phrases, expressions and concepts that we use today to describe independence, resilience and resistance had origins in the vocabulary that medieval women developed to discuss their experiences and strategies. Medieval women enriched the cultural resources available to later generations of women facing similar challenges. Perhaps most importantly, medieval widow resistance established precedents for female political organizing that would eventually contribute to suffrage movements, labor organizing, and contemporary feminism. Medieval widows were the great-grandmothers of modern women's liberation movements. What's remarkable about medieval widow oppression is how similar the patterns were across different cultures and regions that had minimal contact with each other. In medieval China, widows faced pressure to remain loyal to their deceased husband's family and were often prevented from remarrying to preserve family property arrangements. The specific mechanisms were different from European systems, but the fundamental goal of controlling female autonomy was identical. In medieval Islamic societies, widows had more legal protections than European women, but they still faced social pressure to remarry quickly and had limited ability to control their own economic lives. In medieval Japan, widow suicide was sometimes encouraged as a demonstration of loyalty to deceased husbands, creating yet another mechanism for preventing female independence. The universality of these patterns suggests that medieval widow oppression wasn't a European peculiarity. It was a systematic response to the threat that independent women posed to patriarchal social organization. Different cultures developed different specific mechanisms, but they all shared the goal of preventing female economic and social autonomy. This international consistency suggests that medieval societies understood something that modern people often miss, that female independence is inherently revolutionary and threatens existing power structures regardless of the specific cultural context. Medieval widow oppression was a global phenomenon because the threat of female autonomy was understood to be universal, but the resistance patterns were also remarkably similar across cultures. Women in different societies developed comparable strategies for survival, mutual aid and resistance despite having no contact with each other. This suggests that human creativity and the desire for autonomy are also universal forces that transcend specific cultural contexts. Medieval women's resistance was a global phenomenon because the human drive for freedom is universal. The international scope of both oppression and resistance provides important historical perspective on contemporary gender issues. Current gender-based discrimination isn't an aberration or accident. It's the contemporary manifestation of systematic strategies that have been used across cultures and centuries to maintain male authority over female autonomy. Understanding this historical context is crucial for recognizing why gender equality has been so difficult to achieve and why progress has been so uneven across different societies and time periods. Here's something most people don't know. Medieval widow networks played a crucial role in preserving and developing scientific knowledge that would later contribute to the scientific revolution. Many medical and chemical knowledge traditions were maintained by female healers who operated outside official male-controlled educational institutions. These women conducted what amounted to systematic scientific research, developing new treatments, refining existing remedies, and maintaining detailed records of their experimental results. Medieval women were conducting scientific research centuries before the official scientific revolution began. Widows were often central figures in these informal research networks because they had more independence than married women and more resources than unmarried women. They could afford to experiment with expensive materials, travel to gather rare ingredients, and maintain extensive correspondence with other practitioners. Medieval scientific networks were often centered around independent widows. The botanical knowledge that would later be formalized in official scientific texts was often first developed by women who were growing, harvesting, and processing medicinal plants as part of their healing practices. These women understood plant biochemistry in sophisticated ways that wouldn't be officially recognized for centuries. Medieval women were pioneering botanical science while being excluded from universities. Mathematical knowledge was also preserved and developed through women's economic activities. Widows who managed complex business operations, calculated compound interest, and analyzed market trends were developing mathematical skills that were supposedly beyond female capacity. Medieval women were practicing advanced mathematics while being told they were intellectually inferior. Astronomical knowledge was maintained through religious and agricultural practices that were often overseen by women. The calculation of religious festivals, the timing of agricultural activities, and the navigation techniques used in trade all required sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Medieval women were practicing astronomy as part of their daily responsibilities. When the official scientific revolution began, many of the new discoveries were actually knowledge that had been preserved and developed by women working outside official institutions. Male scholars often took credit for systematizing knowledge that women had been developing for centuries. The scientific revolution partly involved men taking credit for women's scientific work. This pattern would continue for centuries, with female contributions to scientific knowledge being systematically minimized or erased, while male contributions were celebrated and preserved in official historical records. Medieval women's scientific achievements remind us that intellectual capacity has never been gender-specific, but opportunities for recognition have been systematically restricted. As we reach the end of our journey through the secret lives of medieval widows, all the threads we've been following converge into a single devastating truth. Medieval society created the most sophisticated system of gender-based oppression in human history. Remember that communal sponge we talked about in Roman bathrooms? That was disgusting, but it was a shared experience that everyone endured equally. Medieval widow oppression was targeted, systematic, and designed specifically to break the spirits of women who had already endured the devastating loss of their husbands. Remember those sand-covered Egyptian floors that tormented everyone equally? Medieval widows faced targeted economic exploitation that was designed specifically to force them into unwanted marriages or destitute dependence. Remember those Greek democratic ideals that were never actually democratic? Medieval widow oppression was the systematic destruction of any possibility that women might achieve the independence that men took for granted. Every thread we've explored minds the legal restrictions, the economic exploitation, the social pressure, the religious manipulation, the psychological warfare, the physical threats, was part of a coordinated system designed to ensure that female independence remained impossible. This wasn't accidental cultural development. It wasn't the result of ignorance or primitive thinking. It was sophisticated social engineering that required complex coordination between legal, religious, economic, and social institutions. Medieval societies understood that independent women posed a fundamental threat to male authority, so they developed systematic strategies for ensuring that female independence could never be achieved or maintained. The women we've been learning about tonight survived one of the most sophisticated oppression systems ever created. They developed resistance strategies, built support networks, and preserved knowledge under conditions that were designed to make all of those things impossible. They endured economic exploitation that would bankrupt modern corporations. They navigated legal systems that made contemporary corruption look amateur. They survived psychological warfare that would break modern minds. And some of them not only survived but thrived, creating businesses, preserving knowledge, and building communities despite living under systems designed to prevent all of those achievements. The women we've been learning about tonight weren't victims. They were revolutionaries who used every available resource to challenge systems designed to destroy their autonomy. They couldn't vote, but they created political networks that influenced community decisions. They couldn't own property legally, but they developed economic systems that gave them practical control over substantial resources. They couldn't get formal education, but they created knowledge-sharing networks that preserved and advanced human learning. They couldn't change the laws, but they found ways to work around, under and through legal restrictions to achieve their goals. They couldn't control social expectations, but they developed strategies for managing social pressure while maintaining their essential selves. Most importantly, they never accepted the premise that their oppression was natural, inevitable, or justified. They understood that the systems controlling them were human creations that served specific interests, and they worked constantly to undermine those systems. Medieval widows were the original resistance fighters in a war that's still being fought today. Every contemporary woman who pursues economic independence, makes autonomous life choices, or refuses to accept gender-based restrictions, is continuing work that began in medieval widow communities. Every modern support network, mutual aid organization, or feminist institution has roots in the survival strategies developed by medieval women who refused to be broken by systematic oppression. Every legal protection that contemporary women enjoy exists because generations of women refused to accept systems that restricted their autonomy and worked to create alternatives. The vote, property rights, educational access, employment equality, reproductive freedom, all of these achievements have roots in the resistance work that began in medieval communities, where widows decided they would rather fight than submit. Medieval widows established the fundamental principle that female autonomy is worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. They proved that human dignity is more important than safety purchased through submission. They showed that resistance is possible even under the most impossible circumstances, and that individual acts of courage can create collective change across centuries. Their legacy isn't just historical curiosity, it's a continuing call to action for anyone who believes that gender equality is worth achieving and maintaining. Tonight, when you turn off this video and go about your modern life, remember the women we've been learning about. When you make independent financial decisions, remember the widows who created underground banking systems to maintain control over their resources. When you choose to remain single or leave an unsatisfactory relationship, remember the women who chose poverty over forced remarriage and exile over submission. When you pursue education or career advancement, remember the widows who created informal learning networks to share knowledge that was officially prohibited to women. When you support other women or participate in mutual aid networks, remember the medieval widows who understood that collective action was essential for individual survival. When you challenge gender-based discrimination or speak up against injustice, remember the women who used every available resource to resist systems designed to destroy their autonomy. The systems that oppressed medieval widows evolved rather than disappearing. Contemporary gender-based discrimination has roots in medieval legal precedents, economic structures, and social assumptions. The resistance strategies developed by medieval widows also evolved and continue to be relevant for contemporary challenges. Understanding this history isn't just academic exercise, it's essential knowledge for anyone who wants to understand how gender-based oppression operates and why it has been so persistent across different historical periods. Medieval widows prove that systematic oppression can be resisted, that human creativity can overcome institutional restrictions, and that individual courage can create collective change. They also prove that the struggle for gender equality has been going on for centuries and will require continued effort from every generation. Their stories remind us that progress isn't automatic, that rights can be lost as easily as they're gained, and that vigilance is the price of freedom. But most importantly, their stories prove that resistance works, that change is possible, and that human dignity is worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Medieval widows were ordinary women who did extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. They show us what's possible when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. As we conclude this marathon journey through the secret lives of medieval widows, there's one final truth we need to acknowledge: these women's stories matter not because they're historical curiosities, but because they reveal something eternal about the human experience. The desire for autonomy, dignity, and self-determination isn't modern or Western or culturally specific. It's fundamentally human. Medieval widows felt the same drive for independence that motivates contemporary women, and they were willing to make the same sacrifices to achieve it. The systems that oppressed them weren't primitive or ignorant. They were sophisticated and deliberate responses to the threat that female independence posed to existing power structures. Those same power structures continue to exist today in evolved forms. The resistance strategies they developed weren't desperate improvisation. They were systematic, coordinated, and remarkably effective approaches to challenging institutional oppression. Those same strategies continue to be relevant for contemporary social justice movements. Medieval widows prove that human nature includes both the capacity for systematic oppression and the capacity for heroic resistance. They show us both how bad things can get and how courageously people can respond when faced with impossible circumstances. Their stories are ultimately hopeful because they demonstrate that no system of oppression, regardless of how sophisticated or comprehensive, can completely destroy the human capacity for resistance and creativity. Medieval societies created the most elaborate systems of gender control in human history, but they couldn't prevent women from finding ways to preserve their dignity, build communities, and create alternatives. If medieval widows could resist systematic oppression while living under legal, economic, social, and religious systems designed to break their spirits, then contemporary people facing lesser challenges have no excuse for passivity. Their legacy is both inspiration and obligation. They proved that resistance is possible. Now it's our responsibility to continue their work under our own historical circumstances. Medieval widows remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. They show us that individual courage can create collective change, and that the struggle for human dignity is worth continuing regardless of the personal cost. Tonight, when you complained about your day, remember that medieval widows survived challenges that would destroy most contemporary people. When you enjoy freedoms that seem natural and inevitable, remember that those freedoms were purchased with centuries of struggle by women who refused to accept systematic oppression. And when you face your own challenges with gender-based discrimination, remember that you're continuing work that began in medieval communities where widows decided that human dignity was worth fighting for. You wouldn't have lasted a week in medieval widowhood, but thanks to the women who did survive and resist, you don't have to. That's their gift to you. The question is, what will your gift be to future generations? The secret lives of medieval widows weren't just historical tragedy. They were the foundation for every freedom that contemporary women enjoy. Their resistance made your independence possible. The least you can do is remember their stories and continue their work.